there's good information about, there's good resources online about. So I don't want to really do a deep dive into any of this stuff because all of you guys are very capable of researching things yourself. What I want to do is just try to provide kind of a high-level overview of a lot of different things. Largely because this is FITC after all, where there's a lot of people here from various different backgrounds, a lot of designers, people that wouldn't maybe necessarily consider themselves developers, or people that are coming from other programming languages or whatever. There's just a lot of different backgrounds. And so for a lot of us, I mean, we've kind of come into front-end development through jQuery and some of the tools that it enables for us. But there's some drawbacks to that as well, of not really having a core fundamental understanding of how JavaScript works in the first place. So I'm going to just try to skip along some of those kinds of things as well and give you some ideas of things to look into a little bit more in your own research. And things that I'm not going to be discussing at all. I'm not really going to be going into your favorite JavaScript MVC framework. I'm not going to be telling you how to set up Angular in 20 minutes. I mean, I'm just going to kind of skip across and see where we end up. Yeah, incidentally, there will be some swag down here at the end as well. First come, first serve. So a little bit about myself. I like to write code. I work as a front-end developer at Shopify currently, and I really like working on, well, front-end development in particular. I work on HTML, CSS, JavaScript, a little bit of everything, but as with a lot of people, I come from another background as well. I've dabbled in other frameworks, other languages, other things like that. Starting to get into more open source stuff, but yeah, currently working as a front-end developer at Shopify. Now, for those of you who don't know Shopify, maybe aren't as familiar with Shopify, essentially it's a platform for e-commerce. We've actually become the world's largest hosted e-commerce platform. As of actually just last week, we just hit 100,000 merchants running on our platform. So it's pretty awesome there. And we transacted over $3 billion in merchant sales, which isn't too bad. So enough about me. Let's talk about you. Let's learn some JavaScript. So the problem is, as I said, a lot of us come from different backgrounds, and our first sort of introduction to JavaScript as a whole is through jQuery. jQuery sort of creates a lot of different constructs that allow us to get into things very easily. But they don't necessarily require that we really understand how they work. And that can be sort of a problem as you start to work on applications that are scaling, and as you start to work on more and more projects. So this sort of leads to what I call jQuery-driven development, coined by Darcy over here. Thanks. Yeah. And to sort of introduce this, I'd like to just start off with a bit of a confession. This was actually something that I wrote 5 or 6 years ago as I was just first getting into front-end development. And this is callback hell. I mean, I'm sure everybody in this room has touched a code base that looks something like this. If it was mine, I'm sorry. But we've all been there. We've all worked on something like this where we have to jump in and even if we can actually implement that feature that's been asked of us, we don't really want to because there's so much fear of potentially breaking something else because there's multiple dependencies, and it just becomes really messy. As things start to scale up and you're trying to find where was that one thing, it becomes exponentially more difficult to track it down and scale with it. Another thing that jQuery actually introduced was really chaining for methods. And this is actually a really powerful paradigm. It was actually very effective. I mean, what it did, it was absolutely amazing. It's still a great thing. I still recommend using it, but it can get out of hand really quickly. If you just kind of keep tacking on new things onto the same jQuery selector, it becomes messy really quickly, and something that breaks at the start of it will just kind of break the rest of the chain, and things start to fall apart very quickly. Another one of these problems is just a lack of understanding around variable declaration and scope. And as an example of this, 3 foos walk into a bar. Developer jokes, I'm so sorry. So this first foo up here is just like, hey, I'm a global variable, what's up? And then the second foo down here is like, I'm a local variable, how are you doing? And so we check in on variable number 1 up here, foo number 1, and it's still global, everything's still good. Then foo 3 comes along. He says he's a local variable too, but when we check in on variable 1, or on foo 1 back again here, we see it's been redefined to local variable. And that's just because we're missing out on this var keyword. JavaScript, by default, assumes that everything should exist on the global scope. And that's sort of a bad thing. Global scope as a whole is kind of a bad thing, but it's something that JavaScript doesn't really try to steer you away from by itself. In fact, kind of the opposite. So this can lead to a lot of problems, as you can imagine. I mean, if you start to expect that the first foo is going to have a certain definition, and it doesn't have it later on, that's going to be kind of problematic for you. And this exists as well, even if I didn't have the first foo there, even if I didn't have something defined in the global scope. If I just say foo, it would automatically create it on the global scope, even though it's inside the function. So, not ideal. I was going to throw in a meme here. JavaScript, how does it work? Huh. JavaScript apparently doesn't have a sense of humor. It's a very complicated, strange beast. So what is the solution to all this stuff? I mean, all of these kinds of problems, the callback hell, the chaining hell, well, how do we get around that? How do we actually become more serious, more focused as JavaScript developers? And the answer is to level up your JS. So just get a really solid understanding of how JavaScript works, how the DOM works, some of these things, and just get a fundamental understanding of how it all fits together, what all the different pieces are, what role they play, and build from there. So one of these things that I think is really important to start with, to look into at least a little bit, is the structure of your application. Starting with a few of the stages of JS app development structure as I see them. I mean, the first one here is that jQuery soup or DOM soup, the sort of callback hell that I was talking about before. And this is totally fine in some situations. If you have a single page, not a single page application, this is fine. If you just have to bind to a few random little click events and things like that, then this is fine. If you start to grow beyond that, it becomes really problematic really quickly. Second stage here is starting to namespace your app by creating one global variable and then nesting everything underneath that. And JavaScript doesn't really have a namespacing per se. I mean, if you're coming from another background, that can be a little bit confusing, I imagine. But really, yeah, it's just creating one global level variable and nesting all your functions, all your objects, everything inside of that. So it just keeps a nice little closure wrapper around what you're working on. Oh, and another thing actually down here is that instead of having multiple document ready calls, you just kind of initialize your object down here once and don't have to worry about it ever again. The third stage is sort of really popular right now, doing the old Backbone, Angular, Ember, whatever it may be, the MV whatever framework, MV star. And this is, of course, really a much more sustainable method where you can actually continue building out applications provided they're well structured and well planned. You can continue to build it out from here, so this is an important one to learn if you're working on those types of projects. Maintainability and modularity. Now, this is another sort of commonly occurring theme as well, is that when you start off in JavaScript development, you'll be inclined to kind of write everything out in one big file and have a number of different pieces that sort of live inside of that file, and it doesn't really break out. If you start working on one piece, you may actually accidentally disrupt another piece. So one of these sort of core principles is to really modularize your code, and by breaking it up into smaller segments, little components that act independently. You can get around some of this. Some of this can occur through, there we go. Some of this can occur, or can be helped by implementing new frameworks, libraries, etc. There's a lot of really good stuff out there. Actually, a developer friend of mine told me once, if if you're looking to build something from scratch, odds are someone in the open source community has already built it and has built it better than you will be able to. And that's really true. I mean, for the most part, it's not often worth trying to build your own components if somebody else has. They've been tried and tested. It might be worthwhile to just use their implementation of it and leverage that knowledge. Preprocessors, another great way to start. I think some of you were here for Berman's talk last on Sass, less, and Stylus and some of those. How many of you have used a JavaScript preprocessor like CoffeeScript or TypeScript? Okay, a few. I highly recommend taking a look at some of that as well, because just like how Sass, for example, sort of encourages you to break things out into separate files using includes. Using CoffeeScript, for example, will really help you sort of break out your JavaScript as well. So you can actually start writing things as components and start bringing them together to deliver them over the wire. And putting it all together, I mean, grunt, gulp, rape, make, cake. Basically, as long as it's a single syllable and onomatopoeia, it probably has a build tool named after it. These are actually of critical importance when you start to build larger applications. I mean, they may seem a little bit intimidating to jump into at first, particularly if you're coming from maybe a design-oriented background, but they really do save you a lot of headaches. There's some great resources available on all of these things and how to use them well. So I highly recommend taking a look at some of those. This book here, actually, JavaScript Design Patterns, the title or the author name got cut off there, it didn't work at all. Anyways, it's written by Adios Manny, who's actually going to be speaking here tomorrow, I believe. So he is a great guy to ask about this stuff, but I say definitely check out this book. By the way, these slides will be available a little bit later, so if you want to get these links, you don't have to frantically write them down right now. But this just sort of outlines some of those design principles and patterns that you come across during your development lifecycle. Performance. There are a number of different things as well to focus on with your performance. As you start to write more and more code, it becomes very easy to let your code sort of just continue to grow. And as it continues to grow, it may not necessarily be proportionally as performant. It may actually significantly decline at once you hit a certain point, if you don't have a solid understanding of some of these performance principles and or plan with them in mind. The first one of these would be caching your selectors. This is something that's often overlooked, I find, actually. But doing something simple, like here we've got just this cache DOM function just living inside of our little app. And basically we just got this little DOM store, this little object. It's just a regular object, nothing crazy. But we're assigning a bunch of variables to live inside of it, and that's just the selector. So whenever I need a new selector, you just add it to this list down here, and then reference it from this myapp.dom object. That way, if you're reusing it multiple times, jQuery doesn't have to keep looking up these DOM elements every time. It can just look them up once, and then whenever you need to reference that later on, you can just pull it in. And it saves a lot of performance, or a lot of performance hit. Another thing is to actually fix your selectors in the first place. jQuery makes it really easy to write selectors to do pretty much anything. Again, that's not necessarily the best way to do things. It can really help to have a good understanding of how jQuery is doing that through Sizzle. But there's a few sort of tips and tricks that will sort of guide you in the right direction. One of those being to increase in specificity as you go from left to right. So as an example here, this is actually a really bad selector because this little guy on the end here, this my element, by the way, you may have noticed that it's an ID. And if it's an ID, there's only one of them on the page. And so everything before it is kind of moot. But you would think it would actually be moot, but jQuery will still try to break it down. So it'll look for all the divs in your document first. Then it'll look for divs with this main content class, and then it'll look for inside of those other divs, and then it'll look for a div with an ID. So it just gets really kind of complex and making jQuery do a lot more work than it really has to do. So a good example would be just doing the ID, just passing it the ID. When you do that, jQuery actually knows this is just an ID. I can just delegate that to the native browser behavior, and it will make the lookup significantly faster because JavaScript doesn't have to look through the DOM, the browser will for you, and that's going to be significantly more performant. Additionally, if you have interesting HTML elements like nav or article or aside or whatever it may be, if there's a few of them, I wouldn't recommend necessarily doing this for div, but some of these kinds of things are also quite performant to do if you're just looking up by tag name. And then also the final tip would be sort of scoping things down and using the jQuery find method within that. So you have this my element, and basically you're passing that to find so that jQuery knows to only look within that element. It doesn't have to look through the whole document to find something that meets these criteria. A good rule of thumb that I find is just to kind of rely much more on the browser behavior and what is actually natively available through your browser's API. So that's get element by ID, get element by class name, particularly actually query selector all. It's often underused as well. Query selector all is basically just the native implementation of the jQuery selector, almost. It actually uses CSS selectors. So everything that you're writing in CSS with fancy CSS3 selectors, whatever else you want to put in there, it supports them all. So you can actually get pretty specific and really, really granular with this query selector all, but at native speeds, which is a big help. So a pro tip would be just, if you don't need jQuery for everything you're doing, you just need to select things, just alias $$ to query selector all so that you can actually just do a lookup using the native lookup. Some other very good resources here that, again, this will all be available online afterwards. Jank, yeah. It's sort of a hot term, I guess, these days with web performance stuff. It really depends on what your own personal definition is of jank. Everybody's kind of calling it, or defining it as something different. I just sort of see it as general performance-related bugs that result in a poor user experience because the page isn't loading fast enough, something's not just responding quick enough, it just doesn't feel right. And there's a few tips for that. Again, I'll just kind of run through them quickly here. Obviously, reduce payload size. If you're trying to load 5 megs of JavaScript over the wire at once, it's not going to be quick. So you just try to strip that down. You can run it through minifiers, augmentification, all these kinds of things as well. Also true of CSS. I mean, I've worked on code bases where CSS is just getting ridiculously long and half the selectors that are in there aren't even being used for anything. So just every once in a while, just clean house, go through, and just wipe a lot of that stuff out of there. Perceived versus actual load time. This is it's a fairly simple one, but it can actually have a pretty significant effect. So that can be something as simple as putting your script elements at the bottom of your body tag rather than in the head. All that does is the HTML and CSS will start to render before the actual JavaScript starts to bind and do its thing. So the actual interface presents itself before you can actually click on things, but it takes people usually a few seconds to decide where they're going to click anyways. So just having this perceived load time just makes it feel that much snappier. Dev tools, not necessarily just Chrome either. Firefox has some great dev tools, but both of them have great ways of testing, well, actually auditing performance. So that would be actually saying, half the selectors in your CSS are not being used. It would be, use only one JS file rather than 5, that sort of thing. But also for the purposes of analyzing your network requests and getting a good look at things, and looking at your painting times, your rendering times. If something is really causing some jank when you're scrolling down the page, you kind of scroll down, so there's a little bit of a glitch, something kind of stutters a little bit, it doesn't feel good, right? So it's DevTools has a great way of auditing what exactly is actually causing that, what color that you're making that is breaking that. And Adios Manny, I think, will be covering some of that stuff as well in his talk. So check that out. Paul Irish, of course, covers a lot of stuff. Finally, just Google. I mean, there's a ton of web performance related stuff out there, but I think without actually planning for it in your application, it's way too easy to just kind of fall behind and not be able to revert those things. So just plan for it from the start of your application. Okay, getting there. So becoming a JavaScript developer, front-end development as a practice, as a competency, has really taken off in the last few years. You know, there's a lot that happened really, really fast, and it's really easy to feel like you're sort of falling behind on it. Things are coming out at an incredible rate, all this Node stuff. You know, there's lots of cool little tools out there, and you know, it's easy to be overwhelmed. So my recommendations for that are just to build something. Just choose something and use tools that you're unfamiliar with entirely. If you've never used CoffeeScript before, use CoffeeScript. If you've never used an HTML preprocessor like Jade or Slim or Hamel or something like that, try one of those out. Try build tools, testing, all this kind of stuff. Just do it at home. Just try playing with some stuff. See if you can get things to work. See if you can get things to break even better. Just get out there and start working on something, even if it's just a to-do app or something like that. Kill your TV. I personally found that it just, you know, as with a lot of people, I like to occasionally watch TV after work. I'll just go home and kind of relax a little bit. But I found by just specifying 2 days per week in my calendar that I'd be working on some sort of project, just for my own personal development. I'd take 2 days per week, and when I come home from work, I would look at all those Chrome tabs that I've got kind of stuffed away in, you know, that other window that's minimized, and actually just go through and read all of them. Go through, read them, try working on something, try working on a project, and if you start working on a project, I have no doubt that you are actually going to want to spend more than those 2 days on it. You're going to end up working through, and it will become, you know, a fun little hobby project, and even if it doesn't go anywhere, you will learn a lot. Another thing is a little bit less abstract, would be just learning promises. Promises are something that are coming with ECMAScript 6 natively, but they're basically already available through jQuery now. They've been available through under the name of deferreds for some time, I think 1.6 of jQuery. But I highly recommend learning it. There's some significant gains to be had there. So without promises, just as an example here, this is actually just making 2 separate AJAX requests and then waiting for both of them to come back. Once they both come back, just want to make a function call. And of course, this can be filtered down. This can be made a little bit smaller, but it's kind of ugly. I mean, what we're doing here, we've got this first AJAX call. You know, if the second call is already returned, then call the function. If it hasn't, say I've returned, you know, balls in your court, and then do the same thing from the second one. I mean, of course, this could be simplified, but just as an example here. But with promises, it's much more semantic. It's much more readable. It's you know, you just take what jQuery gives you back from these AJAX requests and put them into variables, and then say when first call and second call, then do something. I mean, I don't know of any other way that it could be semantically more readable, but it's pretty good. Makes it nice and easy to work with, and there's a whole bunch of other methods in that API that you can start using, like .always, .fail, all these kinds of things to handle all these other cases. But huge gains to be had there. Now, JavaScript is kind of a strange place, admittedly. I think most people who start to get into JavaScript, you know, when they're starting to get comfortable with it, they're kind of like this guy, right? Is sort of, yeah, no, I had enough of this. So just to run through a few of those, quick public service announcement here. If you have a DOM element that has an ID, a global variable is created with that name. And the value that it is assigned is actually the DOM element itself. A lot of people didn't know that. Hoisting. This is another thing that's sort of common cause for concern with JavaScript, or at least a lot of confusion. Up here, you know, we've got this myvar defined. Myvar is 3 in the global scope. Then we come into this function and we console log myvar, and it should be 3, right? Well, no, it's undefined. And that's because down here in this little section of code that we completely forgot about, that's 5 screens down, we're redefining a locally scoped myvar. And what happens in JavaScript is that the variable declarations, that is the var myvar part, get hoisted to the top of the function, and the initialization doesn't. So what that means is basically what the browser is reading this as something like this, and then it just defines it down here. So if we're reading it this way, it sort of makes sense, right? Console log myvar is undefined. Well, that's why. That's what the browser is actually doing when it's running through. So that's the general idea of what hoisting is. And I'll run through some things that sort of help mitigate that a little bit later as well. So a good practice would be to declare your variables at the start of every function. Just inside of the top of the function, declare what you're actually going to be using instead of just declaring it in line where you need it. It makes things a lot easier for debugging in particular because if you're logging something out, then you just look for previous references, and if the first one doesn't actually give it a value, well, there's your problem. CoffeeScript. Another good example of it, CoffeeScript actually does this for you. When you're actually just doing this, what CoffeeScript will do for you is take this var myvar, declare it at the top of the function, and just put it, oops, broke something. Okay. Cool. Yeah, so CoffeeScript will just declare your variables at the top of the function for you. It makes things nice and easy, and a little bit more readable as well. So, for those of you who haven't used it, this is just basically on document ready, console log, myvar. There's a lot of weird little quirky behavior bits with JavaScript as well. Here's a few of them I'll just run through quickly. 5 as a string plus 2, the plus is also used for concatenation of strings, so it just converts the 2 to a string and returns this 52 string. But 5 minus 2, it's actually assuming that it's a mathematical operator, so it converts it to an integer and then does the subtraction. So that's a little bit weird. This is just coercion, so everybody should be using the triple equals sign for most cases. Just to be extra sure because of things like this. The double equals basically just says, if they're not, if these two things that I'm comparing aren't of the same type, then convert one of them to be the type of this one and then compare them. And so that's what's happening here. They're converting the undefined to null, and then they're comparing it. Whereas when you do a strict equality, which is the triple equals, it actually checks that they're the same type as well. CoffeeScript, again, gives that to you as well. This one down here, true equals true, returns true. False equals false, returns false. So again, that's just because of that coercion. True here is being converted, or this true actually is being compared to the first true, so it is being converted to a Boolean value, and then it is returning true. JavaScript. Yeah, so there's a lot of things in here. Why am I a type of operator by itself just returns number? My understanding of this one is just that it just looks for the next object, whatever it may be, and in this case it's just the plus operator, so it assumes it's going to be a number or something, and it just returns why am I a number. Yeah, WTFGS.com. There's a lot of stuff. So the future. There's a lot of cool stuff coming out with ECMAScript 6 that people should be really excited about that sort of alleviate a lot of these problems. First of which, to sort of alleviate that hoisting issue, is block level scoping. So as an example here, we've got this, this array, years. And we are just iterating from 0 to 9, and assigning a function to that position in the array that logs out the year is 20, whatever it is, whatever I it currently is. So when we check years at 4 and call that function, we would think that it would be returning 2014, right? But it doesn't, because this is all global. The for loop doesn't actually count as a function for scoping purposes. So what it's actually doing is it's just this I variable just goes up a level. So by the time we get down here, I still exists. I is 9 because we've finished our for loop. So that's something a little bit quirky. But down here with ECMAScript 6, we've got this let keyword. Sort of see that? Yeah. So we've got this let keyword. And basically what let does is it allows for block level scoping rather than functional level scoping. Which means that, I mean, the block in JavaScript is specifically referring to the curly braces. So in an if statement or for a loop or something like that, it will actually just create a variable that is scoped to just that section so that it won't actually drift outside of that, which is really nice. So it actually does the right thing and logs out the year 2014. Awesome. Default parameters, it's probably pretty familiar to most people coming from other programming languages. I mean, ActionScript and CoffeeScript and everything pretty much has some sort of default parameters. JavaScript is finally getting them, which is pretty cool. Spread operators, basically this is similar to Ruby or CoffeeScript or something like that, where it just basically takes a splat. And that is basically everything that comes after this arg1 would go into an array. So currently with JavaScript, we have the arguments array inside of every function that just checks for whatever the function is called with and just returns an array of those arguments. But what this does is it actually allows you to specify which ones you want. So you can switch these around as well if you want to have a whole bunch of args and then take the last one and put it into this variable. It allows you to be a little bit more custom with your arguments. And lots of other cool things. So there's a lot of cool stuff that's coming with ECMAScript 6, classes, destructuring, constants, generators, some really neat stuff. And a lot of this may look a little bit scary because it doesn't currently exist in JavaScript, but it's actually not particularly complicated stuff. So I definitely recommend finding just some good resources on it. There's a ton of good articles on some of the new stuff with the ES6. But how? How do I get to start using these things? They're not really natively implemented in browsers yet. ES6 isn't really coming for a little while. It's sort of here in some places, but not really in others. There's some fairly smart guys at Google, bit of an understatement there, who have developed this thing called Tracer, which is basically a JavaScript library that transpiles ECMAScript 6 to ECMAScript 5, 5 being the version that we currently use. So that means that we can actually start using this in browser or in Node or in a number of different environments. And one of the ways to do that, actually, I just wrote myself, which was just a Chrome DevTools extension that allows you to convert ES6 to ES5 and just run it in browser. So. So as an example here, this guy up. So yeah, I can just do stuff in here. So I can do like for let. So that's using the let keyword there, and it's actually doing the right thing and creating a global variable, or creating a local variable rather, scope to that. So if I run this again, logging out I, should get log I is undefined, and that's because I only exists in the context of that for loop, which is pretty nice. So that's one of the things that's coming with ES6. Yeah, this is available now in the Chrome store. Those of you who want to play around with it. It's still a little bit buggy, admittedly, but feel free to add issues to my GitHub for it. So final takeaways. Basically just avoid callbacks and chaining hell. Don't avoid callbacks. Avoid callback hell and chaining hell. By using promises and things like that. There's a lot of these methods that are available that allow you to sort of structure your app a little bit more. Use globally scoped variables. Using them hurts kittens. So just try to create some sort of namespaced object to sort of localize everything and keep them running internally. Learn how to use selectors well and use query selector all a little bit more. build something, anything, seriously, build a to-do app, build something. And stay on top of future tech. So there's some awesome new stuff. It's going to be a huge help if you learn some of it immediately. And it'll help you sort of feel like you're not falling behind anymore because you know something that's not even here yet. So highly recommend that. And that's it. Thanks.